It's actually funny that we're talking about this because actually this reminds me. So yesterday when I was at the buddy's house, we were having a conversation about there's an interesting little office in Minnesota that not a lot of people know about. So we were talking about like oversight and all this stuff. We're having a political discussion and all this, and talking about government and talking about oversight with like specific departments of government. And this buddy of mine brings up this thing, the Minnesota office of the ombudsman.
Yeah.
You know about this thing, right? Like what this is?
I don't know the specific. Yeah, we have ombudsman in the UK and in Trinidad and stuff like that. It's
I've never heard of this word till yesterday.
Oh, you've never heard of an ombudsman? Yeah.
And the reason about it, I think, is just because it's such a small office that, like, so I asked him about it. And he goes, yeah. I mean, he goes, really? In Minnesota? At least so far in Minnesota, as far as he knows, the ombudsman is just a big old office with lawyers that don't really do anything.
Right. I mean, they're usually different offices, like the financial ombudsman, the agricultural ombudsman, traffic.
Yeah, but I mean, so for the viewers and listeners, the ombudsman is supposed to be an office that is basically looks into complaints or claims against specific government departments of maladministration.
Yes,
basically people government organizations not doing the right thing or being abused, the powers or their as being abused in some way. They look into it. Now here's where it gets interesting. So we're talking about all this, and he gave me a specific thing. I won't get too much into detail, but basically where someone he knew was trying to call in to put in a tip to look into basic maladministration, and through that, the ombudsman office basically dispatched a bunch of lawyers that ended up actually harassing some people.
Okay,
as part of, by looking into this case, basically was like really overstepping like decency, like being decent about because this whole thing was just abused. Like, so the ombudsman's office was being like their powers are being abused. They went in and did all this, and nothing was found, obviously.
Right.
So later on, these people then call the ombudsman office, and what they can do, depending upon certain things, like obviously if they want some information that the ombudsman has on a specific case, and if there's no national security, secrets or safety concerns, like under the Freedom of Information Act, you can request just about anything from the ombudsman's office, because it's just stuff that's either is public record, or you can ask them to make a public record by what they call an FOIA request. The ombudsman office, however, reserves the right, still, for some reason, basically illegally, reserves the right to say no.
Interesting. On the Freedom of Information request.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, there's this case I want to look into, which has no national security concerns, no safety concerns, no ongoing investigation. Like, it's a completed, record. It's a completed thing that they've looked into. I'd like to request that, an FOIA request, and the ombudsman office can say no.
Interesting. I think it comes down to the department, and because they do have oversight powers. Like, I used the ombudsman when I had an issue against the bank that I was involved with out here. I'm not going to say their name. And they because they're financial ombudsman, they directed me on the best course of action to take it. But again, it's a leftover Commonwealth thing, and because the Americans kind of pride themselves on not being European, I'm not entirely surprised that the federal government has kind of squashed the accountability of the ombudsman office.
Yeah,
Your
so
system is very different to ours.
well, this is the Minnesota's ombudsman, so state ombudsman. But yeah, he was so he was looking into that, and he basically said like, so they, these people started like really digging into it, like why can the ombudsman just really just like literally just reject our request for like our right to information? And they said, well, he'll do it all the time. And I said, well,
most of them don't want to work.
Well, so then they looked into well, who actually is like who's the oversight for the ombudsman's office? Yeah. Oh, and it's like some what is it? Some committee in the Minnesota House of Representatives,
right?
But they never exercise that power,
right? Yeah.
So it's this kind of like there's a bit of like this like circular problem here. There's like one department watches the other, and then there's another department over here watches that one. But in the end, no one's really watching anyone.
I mean, it's the same problem we have here. So we've got a ruling from the Supreme Court on the case, and it was thrown out because the judge is basically his whole premise is to push EU law in the UK. Who do we go to? We now have to go up to not the European Court of Justice, that's something different, but the European Court on Human Rights. So we have to go to a court even above our Supreme Court and basically try to appeal to this is not part of the EU. It has Europe in it. It's a different type of court. To basically say, well, look, there's no grounds for this to be thrown out. Look, all these other people have commented on it, judges, politicians, lawyers, and they all say it's legitimate. This person can't just whimsically decide that. But this is the flaw when you politicize the justice system. That the whole point of the appeal up to the Supreme Court is supposed to act as accountability. So you get something crazy out of, in your case, like the Ninth Circuit Court, some crazy left-wing nonsense, trying to steal people's guns or whatever the case is. You are supposed to appeal it up to the Supreme Court, and you find out once and for all. And that's kind of how the common law has always dealt with that kind of accountability. But It's flawed when the institutions become politicized. Right? Especially when there's money involved. Like, for us, there's a lot of European money coming into our justice system. They've basically bought out the legislature. The legislature in this country is fully on board with Europe because that's their long-term retirement plan. They serve here and then they go and they become lobbyists and make, six-figure salaries.
Yeah.
It's fucked.
The thing with the ombudsman's office I heard was just basically, they employ a bunch of lawyers, and these lawyers can just bill hours.
Yeah.
And
they don't actually have to do anything.
And money is just coming out. Like, they said with this, when the ombudsman office had to respond to this false tip, like they actually had to go through, like lawyers came in, were doing all sorts of digging. So then, so you look at that, it becomes like, if they're digging through files they're not allowed to, then it becomes, what is it? Then that could touch on to like, searching without a warrant, then, asking all these questions. So basically, it's pushing and abusing a lot of these constitutional rights of just citizens, and then they get paid for it. And then it's all funneled through our tax dollars, Yeah.
The whole mechanism is funded by tax dollars.
Yeah, because we got to this because I was talking about like who is the ultimate oversight? Like who is the oversight of the oversight of the oversight? Like what's the cycle? Because
the ultimate answer is your Second Amendment, right? That's kind of the last stop of everything.
What I'm saying is, if you're looking through the supposed infallible system of government. We talked about like the how I guess you could call it the inherent problem of this if you want this constitutional republic that we have is 1776. Everything's great. Like we just Well, I understand what I'm saying here.
Yes,
in terms of like the political and the government, like let's move forward a little bit into like the 1800s. Things are getting a little better. Like we have these, the government is as it stands. You don't have all these crazy departments. The government's not overbloated. You have a lot of things going on. Then, so America's like very, very free. Like in a lot of ways, I've talked to like minarchists and stuff. They say they really like, at least in terms of principle, like the beginning of America.
Yeah.
And I was talking to someone about this too. They said basically America has so much freedom and so much sort of leeway when it comes to how it's been developed over the last 200 some years. That's a big part of why it is the way it is today. So we have all this unexplored territory with this constitutional republic.
Mm-hmm.
So all this freedom, people are like basically, and the individuals started to step in. We talked about like the mutual aid societies. There's a lot of these things where individuals and organizations stepped in to supply all these things to society.
Right.
We talked about like, and if you look at like early Second Amendment type stuff, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine. You and I talked about that before.
Yeah.
In the beginning, the government would wage war by basically renting militias and weapons and military assets from the people. Like they didn't have their own army.
Exactly.
But then, because there's all this unexplored, territory that the government didn't really look into, that gave them that freedom, gave the government the freedom to eventually come up with their own army, establish a national bank. And as you move forward a little bit more, you get our first progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, and we start printing money. We started.
Well, I mean, you were still on the gold standard at that point. It wasn't until the 1970s with Nixon where it really got out of control with the central bank. But yeah, I understand the point. I mean, the institutions that kind of quote unquote enslave us were birthed out of freedom, and they were birthed out of the idea of the public good, when really and truly it's kind of a power grab. So
right, and the fall of mutual aid societies in the Great Depression was because the government, so you had, not only did you have a depression, but you had the Dust Bowl. That double whammy basically cornered the government to go, oh shit, we need a little bit of welfare.
Yeah, it's a humanitarian emergency, and which is always how it is. It's always how it goes. Yeah,
that bloated into what we have today, where you pop out a couple extra kids and you're taken care of for life.
Yeah.
And so, so we talked about that. Yeah, that's the problem. It's like, constitutional republicanism is great until shit hits the fan. And
in terms of history, constitutional republics last the longest. So we got the Spartan Empire that was a constitutional republic, lasted 800 years. Generally, a democracy doesn't last more than about 200 to 300 years, right? The Roman Empire, again, was a pretty good version of a constitutional, but I think, the Senate kind of overruled everything. But so it's the best we've got. It's the best that we've got. But I completely, all government, every single one has the same inherent problem, right? And